Women's suffrage in Michigan. Most history makes women's suffrage to be about how women just wanted the right to vote. That is not the case. The women in Michigan's history have given the women today the rights that they deserve to have. The women's suffrage movement was a big event, and especially in Michigan, as the women in Michigan were helping other women who didn't want to speak up or fight for their rights, and the other women in different states. Women of history deserve to be recognized for what they have achieved for the women of today, and the women of today should follow in their footsteps, continuing to fight for the women of the future. The women's suffrage movement hit Michigan in the year of 1846, when women's rights advocate Ernestine Rose gave speeches at the Representative Hall in Michigan's first Capitol building. Ernestine Rose wasn't the only woman who to advocate for women either. There are multiple historical women who have fought for women's rights, but she was one of the most influential. Ernestine Rose's impact on women's suffrage movement was very big as she would give speeches at yearly conventions that were held because of the women's suffrage movement. She would also go to things that were held for the women's suffrage movement. She traveled from Maine to South Carolina and from the East Coast to Iowa, sponsoring women's rights. She also attended many abolishment and free thought rallies. Anderson. More influential women that have also had an impact on the women's suffrage movement in Michigan was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan Brownell Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, as they wrote a book titled History of Women's Suffrage. The impact these women have had on Michigan was incredible. When they traveled to Michigan, they knew that they would find intelligent women who were looking for someone to advocate for them, and they discovered there was another influential woman who was already advocating for women in Michigan. Many institutions of learning early open to girls, and partly to the extensive social influence of Miss Lucinda H. Stone, whose rare culture, foreign travels, and liberal views have fitted her, both as a woman and as a teacher, to inspire the girls in Michigan with desire for thorough education. History of Women's Suffrage, page 513. The hope for more influential women was seen by other women who were key parts of the suffrage movement, and they saw what women wanted for the girls of the future. The 1920s is when the 19th Amendment was passed, which is what most historians nowadays focus more. But it went through so much to actually be passed. Before this amendment was even considered, there was very little that people did to support the women's suffrage movement before the year 1870. In 1870, however, this is when the Michigan Suffrage Association was founded, along with the founding of the Northwestern Association. Many efforts were made to get a women's suffrage amendment to the state constitution. The amendment then was placed on the November ballot to receive the approval of electoral necessary for it to become a law. Rubenstein Wars, page 117, paragraph 2. This being put in the ballot, supporters of this movement had hopes that Michigan, being a progressive state, would be successful in getting passed in Michigan, as Michigan has a large population. The campaign also depended on the appearance of prominent women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, but there were issues that arose from the suffrage movement being shown in the press. However, importation of foreigners who had grown gray in denouncing the abuse of men and moaning their unhappy conditions was resented by much of the Michigan press, irrespective of their editorial position on the suffrage issue. Apathy was the major factor, however, working against passage, as most voters did not feel strongly about the question. Rubenstein, page 118, paragraph 1. as this made it to where people were questioning if the suffrage movement was completely bypassing the men that struggled during this time too. This led to when the votes came back from being placed in the ballot in November, and sadly to the disappointment of all the women and their supporters, the movement was completely crushed in voting by people who were afraid of alcohol probation, and this made Susan B. Anthony bitter. And she stated that in Michigan, every whiskey maker, vendor, drinker, gambler, every besotted man was against us. Rubenstein, Watser, page 118, paragraph 2. After this defeat, this led the movement to become inactive for years until the year 1884 came around, where Michigan Equal Suffrage Association was founded in Battle Creek with Mary Doe as president and Governor Josiah Cole as vice president, and even Michigan's 2 United States senators advocated for the movement, but there was no support from anyone. In 1908, they tried to get another document for the movement put in place, but this document also failed to get through. In 1918, this newspaper was printed, and the newspaper was from Detroit, which was showing how the women victoriously got the women's suffrage amendment to make it to the state constitution to be considered for, and amendment, Lansing State Journal. Luckily, in the year 1920, there was finally a success in getting the amendment passed, as it was put into the Constitution and gave women the right to vote and be equal to men. The road that the women and the supporters of the cause took was long, but in the end, these women got themselves and the women for the future equal rights to vote. This leads us to the effects the suffrage movement had on women nowadays because of the suffrage movement. It has given so many women in Michigan and the world amazing opportunities. Decades after the suffrage movement, women decided to celebrate the women who fought for their rights. They would all meet on the Capitol lawn for the Women's March in Lansing. Women's March on Lansing. This march was especially important in the year 2018, as this had marked the 100 years since the 19th Amendment was passed. This year marks the centennial of women's suffrage in Michigan, when women activists and their supporters, on their 4th attempt, finally convinced male Michiganders to approve an amendment to the state constitution giving women the right to vote, Lansing State Journal. Executive Director of the Michigan's Women's Historical Center and Hall of Fame, Caitlin Perry Dial, stated, Michigan suffragists could have quit after that first election, decided, well, we'll get suffrage when they're ready to give it to us and we'll stop fighting. They constantly campaigned for suffrage 2 more times after that and still lost until 1918. They never gave up. The greatest thing about the story of the suffrage in Michigan is that they persisted. Lansing State Journal. The turnout for this event was phenomenal, as there were thousands of women and their supporters that showed up to the march, which proves how much the women and the supporters of history helped inspire the women and their supporters today. Women of history deserve to be recognized for what they've achieved for the women of today, and the women of today follow in their footsteps to fight for the women of the future. The women of history have proven to men for years that they can be just as important as men. I believe they are. These women proved to these men that they can do the exact same job the exact same way that they do it, or prove that they can do better. The women fought for so many rights for women in Michigan, and the women of today still have to prove how good of a job they can do. But thanks to these women, it has lessened in how much they have to prove. Women of today, are you willing to fight for what's right for you and the women of the future?